All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second and later on the third panels for the Anthropology Caucus. The titles for both this morning's panel and the afternoon's panel is Racialized Bodies, Athletic Experiences. The second panel will be at 4 in the afternoon today. But I want to just say a few things about both panels that we have for today here and the participants who we've gathered. This is our first meeting. For many of us, it's our first NASH, but as a group, it's our first meeting that is part of a group that has another conference in the horizon. Tracy and I were fortunate enough to receive a Winter Grant Foundation Symposium grant. And so the people who will participate here today will also be traveling to Segovia, Spain next year, March of 2024, to continue these conversations and workshop papers that will later be part of a special issue of Current Anthropology. We have included purposely anthropologists, sociologists, historians, scholars from the field of cultural studies, and journalists who will be, they're not here, all those folks are not here with us today, but they will be joining us in Spain next year. Our interdisciplinary, cross-institutional, and intergenerational collective will holistically consider the lived experiences of structurally marginalized athletes, given their participation in racist, sexist, nationalist, and ableist sporting systems. Specifically, we will address questions such as: how are athletes used by and potentially exploited by teams, bureaucratic organizations, and nations? How do tensions between competition and collaboration and equality and fair play inform their lives and their social worlds? How are athletes' lived experiences constituted, either at play or in the real world? Ultimately, what does research motivated by these questions contribute to the broader theoretical and methodological questions about the body, embodiment, racialized and gendered experiences, well-being, care, and resistance and power? Scholars in this seminar and this presentation today and the seminar which we're putting together for the future represent an intentionally diverse group of worldwide voices. This diversity of positionality, coupled with our interdisciplinarity, will also be of relevance in our discussion by pointing to the marginalized position we hold within our disciplines, which only further highlights the importance of the work we do. We aim to harness diversity of thought within the disciplines to think about diversity itself, as systematically marginalized voices in anthropology and beyond gather to theorize the lived experiences of those who we work with. So, further ado, let's get started. Our first presenter is a virtual presenter via Zoom. It is Veena Mani, and where is come in India? In India? Yeah. Okay. I can't hear India. So yeah, let's get started.
Thank you, Gabby. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Gabby and Tracy, for putting together this panel. I'm excited to listen to everyone here. So my paper is titled Racialized Bodies, Athletic Experiences, Working Around the Silences in the Field on Race. I study the narrative centered on a regional non-formal sport in south of India, a state called Kerala, and within the state, a region called Malabar. That is, this regional sport is simultaneously at the heart of the regional pride and also an avenue for work for many men in the region in addition to many players who migrate for football work from African countries. So the football here is not American football, but the global. The presence of these migrant players break the silences around race in Kerala public sphere, or one would assume. While they bring out narratives of racialization, one would hardly find anti-racist narratives, for there is no identification of racism, racialization, or racial difference as an issue in the public narratives around this regional sport called sevens football. So sevens football is a version of the international football which is recognized by FIFA. I have written about the aspects of masculinity's work, formation of political communities, and the care networks that include the native people and migrant men within the context of sevens football. Whenever I discuss the presence of African players in the regional sport, I have been asked to further explain the process of racialization. Needless to say, it is a valid and important aspect to explore. However, writing about race and racialization from a society which considers itself monoracial or raceless brings in its own challenges. This does not mean that there are no racialized undertones in everyday interactions on and off the field. For instance, the increased pay the African players are given is justified by the exotic value they bring for the spectators in the regional setting. Additionally, the racist stereotypes of naturalized sporting prowess and ascribed capacity for brisk and rough play, which sevens football format demand, makes these migrant players highly desirable for the tournament organizers, managers, and most importantly, the fans. Also, with this desire comes a fear. While their blackness is desired, it is also feared within and without the sporting field. The players who hail from the region speak about how risky it is to play against the African players. The players' roughness and tackling are always overstated and feared when they are on the other side and desired when they are in your team. In order to highlight these players' hyper-visibility, let me quickly lay out the context of sevens football. Sevens football is easy to identify during its occurrence, but escapes strict definitions. The dimensions of the field and the time span within which the match is played are quantitatively smaller and shorter compared to the standard laws governed by Federation International, the Football Association. Like the dimensions of the field, which is 105 by 85 meters, is not strictly followed even among the field owners by top professional teams in the world. Dimensions of sevens football fields vary across the region in one part. However, most players find sevens field to be approximately 25 by 18 meters. In a region which lack stadiums proper, sevens football fields are temporal spaces carved out of public grounds, temple or mosque courtyards, and those paddy fields immediately after the crops are harvested. The relatively short space of this football field shapes the mode of play, which is characterized by quick movements, knee-jerking tackles, and short passes. The number of goals in a sevens match will be relatively higher than a standard football match, owing to the size of the field and pace of the game. Goals are normally scored from a short range because of the narrow width of the goalposts. This brisk form of play keeps spectators on their toes and constantly reproduces a specific aesthetic of football particular to this format. One of the distinct features of the sevens is the leniency towards fouls, and that defines the ways in which sevens is played and received by the spectators. Techniques and aesthetics of sevens football drastically varies from that of the standard football. Rules differ to please the audience. One of the important differences in the rules of the sevens from the standard format is how the fouls are exercised and punished. Fouls are not intensely monitored and checked. Instead, they are encouraged to certain limits. Red card would not ban a player for 2 matches, but only temporarily keep him away from the field for a few minutes. The player is let to play again in the same match. The effect of this primarily leads to 2 consequences. 1, there is an increase in the number and severity of fouls, and 2, players are given an immunity to make fouls. The reason for this flexibility on fouls is attributed to the assumption that spectators enjoy watching a game which is saturated with spectacular performance of aggression that is identified as masculine. Narratives from the field reflected and reproduced the notions of classism and casteism in the country. The ways in which the violence of the football field are talked about is contingent on the subjects of the narration. Terms such as tough and able replace terms like aggressive and nuisance when talking about the fouls committed by players who are from relatively upper class and castes. This is particularly evident when discussing the play of African players in the sevens tournaments. There's a trend of naturalizing the strength and capacity for violence of these players, and this reconfiguration of violence produces specific racial, masculine, and labor subjectivities through the bodies of these African players. The encounter with players from African countries such as Nigeria, Sudan, and Liberia in sevens football in Malabar complicate the notion of sport as informal work through intersections of race and ethnicity. By this, I do not mean that prior to the migration of these African players, there were no racial differentiations or discussions in Malabar. The Malabar region is identified as cosmopolitan and always connected with the rest of the world through its histories of trade, religious exchange, and dynamics of culture. The racialization of the African players occur within the already existing racialized narratives of certain communities, which are assimilated, yet at times exoticized. So they're not identified as race. Sometimes it's just identified as caste. For instance, families and communities which trace its lineage to mixed marriages between Arab men and native women still try to practice endogamy and keep themselves distinct from the other communities in the region. These families are relatively affluent and follow a matrilineal system of family. Nevertheless, it should also be noted that there existed other inter-ethnic marriages, and they did not necessarily enjoy similar social privileges. The social status of the mixed ethnic marriages depended on the socio-economic backgrounds of the native women. In most cases, the women stayed back, at least in the initial years, and men would visit them annually or biannually from the Persian Gulf. Sometimes these women are brought back to the country of these men, while some women, along with their children, stayed back. Similarly, there is another family in Kolkot, in Malabar, who identifies themselves as descendants of Yemeni merchants. Such kinds of racialization is ascribed, but also self-identified. Most of these communities are proud of their ethnicity that are portrayed as different from that of the natives, and increasingly identify themselves as closer to the Savarna or upper caste elites in Kerala. Sonia Thomas has discussed how such assemblages of race, religion, caste, and class complicate the notion of race in South Asia. Such racialization in consonance with casteist and classist narratives are used by the communities to distinguish themselves from their neighbors who belong to the oppressed castes and working class. A study into the participation of African players in sevens tournament uncovers a complex economy involving team managers, tournament organizers, and brokers. I met a group of 9 players from different countries in Africa, mostly from Nigeria and Liberia, in a small town in Malabar. I contacted them through a team manager named Vinay, who was considered the nodal agent of African players in the sevens network. He took me to the house where he put up these players to stay. These players welcomed me immediately and asked to stay for lunch. They seemed exceptionally happy to meet me and explained to me how people love them during matches, but refused to have friendly conversation outside the playground. Samuel, one of the players from Nigeria, and along with others, we sat and we spoke only in the presence of this manager. I did not have direct access. I did not have an unmediated access to these players, and I would mostly attribute it to the strict gendered segregation in the Kerala public and often in the private sphere. These segregations were invisible yet solid. There is a very strong moral angst whenever I met any of the male interlocutors in the region. They constantly worried about what others would think and were worried about their image as a respectable head of the house. Nevertheless, innuendos and discreet suggestions for a possible sexual encounter were never rare in the field. Contrary to that, the African players seemed not to worry about any image while speaking with me. I should also note that I was not able to maintain a long, deep relationship with any of them. Due to the restricted mediated access I was given. The players had come to India through employment visas arranged by brokers in their respective countries and team managers like Vinay in Malabar. Vinay was not only their manager, but he was also portrayed as a caregiver. He arranged their accommodation and hitched them with different teams in the regions. Vinay acts as the agent through which these players navigate the football labor networks, not only internationally, but also intra-regionally. Vinay negotiates their remunerations and informs the players about prospects and football schedule. Team managers across the region contact Vinay when they need African players for their matches. Players from Africa, regardless of which country they came from, are called Sudus in Malabar. Sudus are short form for Sudanese. There are no written records available on how African players became a part of this small regional network of football in South India. Many believe that a few Africans came to Malabar to join the medical and arts colleges in the late 90s. They started playing in the local football tournaments, and team managers found a possibility of using their labor to benefit the respective teams. Team managers and tournament organizers paid them a better remuneration than they gave to the best of the native players. Tournament organizers specifically asked team managers to include African players to attract more people to the sevens matches. Players from Africa I talked to were all in their early 20s, and they explained how they came here looking for better prospects of work through football. They described how football is an everyday activity in the respective countries and how competition to get in the local clubs there is tough. They agreed that they found the prospects here better than in their regions and how they were determined to make the best out of it. Experiences of African players in Malabar is permeated by accounts of alienation and discrimination. As noted earlier, they find themselves excluded from spaces outside that of the football field. They explained to me how they find the social life impossible and how their access to many social spaces are extremely limited. The split in the on-field and off-field receptions seemed to distress the new members in the African player community. These players who have been here for more than one footballing season explain how they're here only for work and have accepted the situation as it is. The ways in which football shapes desire and subjectives reaffirm the co-constitutive power of spaces and subjects. The transnational labor subjectivities produced through a semi-formal sport format pushes the boundaries of sport, transnational labor category of work. The format of sevens eludes the easy binary of formal and informal sport. Sevens is formalized in a way that is organized regularly, and the networks of work, entertainment, and sociality is fostered through it. However, it is deliberately delinked from the official body of football and take up the liminal space of continuity and rupture of official football language. Sevens is at the same time center and the margins in the narrative of football in Malabar. This positionality depends on the moment of enunciation and voice one chooses to narrate the sport. On the other hand, the ways in which the crucial international labor for the sport is brought through the channel of formal international and national laws, albeit minor negotiation. Then framing of visa applications skillfully places the player within the category of employment specified as football. The experience of African players in Malabar bring out the ways in which the nexus of race, ethnicity, masculinity, sport, and work. Racialized subjects are produced within the site of sports, and these practices produce distinct labor subjectivities. Sport, which is a space of bodily practices, performances, and spectacle, highlights and reproduces the dominant ideologies in the region. The ways in which various actors in the football network including fans, team managers, tournament organizers, and native players respond to these African players, reproduce their racialized labor subjectivities. These foreign players always occupy a position of marginality, where the margins are constantly in flux and temporarily positioning at the center only when the game begins. The stories of resistance are mostly interpersonal, and at this stage, their visa status does not allow for any kind of mobilizations to discuss and resist the racial discrimination or any other workplace issues that they face. So there is a kind of silence that is formed around it, even though there are everyday interactions, everyday expressions of their racialized experience in the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Veena, for that wonderful presentation. I forgot to mention at the beginning that because we had someone drop out of the afternoon panel, I will be presenting in that in the afternoon, and in order to even out the presentations and discussion time. So up next, Bernardo Rios.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the session organizers for hosting this caucus, and to Nash for having us again back this year. I've been fortunate enough to meet a lot of individuals here over the course of my early graduate career, and then as a junior faculty member. And I just want to say, for a long time, I think we've kind of worked in solitude, and so I just feel very grateful and humble and just very delighted that we're converging here today. And so today I'm going to be talking about portions of a research paper that I'm just starting. So mostly ideas. I have a lot. I'm not going to get through all of it. Similar to my friend, my colleague Thomas Carter yesterday, I got to figure out a way to get on a second panel. That's a slick move. So we live in a world where identity is complex. Mixed race individuals' experience are often compounded by multiple layers of ethnic identity, systems of oppression, and racial capital. Within the realm of sports, the Black male athlete has been commodified and stereotyped, perpetuating damaging ideas about race and masculinity. However, little attention has been paid to the experiences of Black athletes who are also multi-ethnic, and how their identity intersects with their athletic experience in various cultural spaces. This paper explores the multi-ethnic sporting experience using contributions in ethnic studies to analyze the intersections of race and ethnicity in the social imagination of multi-ethnic Black athletes from Mexican and Filipino communities in the US. It focuses on the complexities of multi-ethnic identity, examining the experiences of Black athletes in basketball culture. So the goal is to highlight the unique experiences of multi-ethnic Black athletes and accentuate the importance of intersectional analysis in sports studies. And so that's what I kind of want to focus on today, since I'll be conducting the fieldwork this summer. And so historically, most multiracial research limits analysis to examining whiteness in relation to non-white ethnic minorities. This paper contributes to the growing literature on multi-ethnic studies by focusing on the Black athlete in disposition to what I call a BIPOC mentality and a multiracial reality. BIPOC mentality is grounded in historical systems of oppression placed on BIPOC populations through colonial greed under the guise of manifest destiny, Monroe Doctrine, Jim Crow, whereby multi-ethnic Black people have few, if any, ethnic choices. Some scholars use the term symbolic ethnicity to describe the inclination for multi-ethnic Black folks to defer to racial ascriptions of Blackness in socio-political settings, whether that be voting, other social settings. The multiracial reality, I argue, is experience understood and embodied through the multiple layers of what I call ethnic virtue. I argue multi-ethnic Black athletes capitalize on their Blackness within sports. Their ethnic experiences and cultural awareness provide a powerful tool to traverse their Blackness, independent of their Blackness as an opposition to whiteness in ethnic social spaces. So based on contributions of sociologist Reginald Daniel, I'm going to use the term multi-ethnic in place of mixed race or multiracial to recognize that ethnicity incorporates the intersections of race and culture. And so the experiences of multi-ethnic individuals have been marginalized or ignored in social scientific research. This is particularly problematic given the increasing number of multi-ethnic individuals in the US and the unique challenges they may face as the discourse circumventing race in America continues to unfold. And so by centering multi-ethnicity, I try to build on current sports research that allows us to better understand the ways in which race and identity operate within sporting culture. And so I'm trying to challenge the dominant narrative and power structures by centering multi-ethnic voices and providing a space to share their experiences about race and racial identity in sports. I think it's essential to decenter whiteness in multi-ethnic studies, and in particular, all studies, especially sports studies, and embrace ethnic value that has survived in response to attempted assimilation, eradication. At the core, this research challenges the core white narrative, and as Bell Hooks argues, instead focuses on BIPOC love, beauty, and legacy as an epistemological base for critical intellectual insight, regardless of its H-index score. Although I say that from a place of privilege as just being promoted, but I think it's important. It's time to move beyond the canon of the great white male thinker in anthropology and most disciplines, I think. Throughout my research with indigenous folks in Oaxaca, Mexico, they've shared the power of indigenous knowledge and insight, highlighting their ingenuity is long overdue, and it starts with our accountability as scholars participating in the academy. Instead, this research acknowledges that race and gender are not separate categories, but rather intersect and impact the experiences of individuals in complex ways. And so regarding ethnicity and culture, folks like, Gloria Anzaldúa and Patricia Zavella offer a framework to understand the complexity of cultural representation from a more private setting, like in the household, to a more public environment, like a neighborhood or a region, or even in a global context, like a nation state. Cultural representation is wrapped in nuances of language, heritage, customs, traditions. Therefore, research that models on multiculturalism needs to decenter whiteness and imagine ethnicity not as a defining line of possessiveness or domination, but instead as a practice of love that involves the mutual respect, care, empathy towards others. Ultimately, I question, how do multi-ethnic athletes use their ascribed status, being Black, and their achieved status, whether that's Mexicano or Filipino, in complex ways to capitalize on different things at different times in different places? The sport of basketball has a long, complicated history with race and racism in the United States. The predominance of Black athletes in professional basketball has led to many issues related to race and identity. We've heard many presentations about that here at the conference. However, incorporating intersectionality and Black feminist pedagogy into the analysis of sport and basketball and the Black athlete can provide new insights and solutions to these issues and these topics. Building on contributions, from my colleague here, Gabriel Torres, centering the racial experience in the totality of racial categorization provides an excellent foundation to start this conversation. Using intersectionality to analyze the sport of basketball and the Black athletes means acknowledging how multiple social identities intersect and impact individual experiences. For example, a Black athlete may face discrimination not only because of their race, but also because of their gender, sexuality, class, ability, whatever it may be. By recognizing and understanding these interactions, we can better understand the experiences of multi-ethnic Black athletes in the sport of basketball and develop more effective strategies to address issues related to race and identity. Incorporating Black feminist pedagogy in the analysis of sport and basketball, the Black athlete means recognizing the importance of centering the voices and experiences of Black women and other marginalized individuals. And that starts with us as researchers too. This isn't something that I just say. This is a lifelong practice that I'm constantly trying to learn. My mother's here in the audience right now, listening to me, and she humbles me every time I get to see her, right? This is Black feminist pedagogy or thought is a lifelong practice. And so how do we engage with that while we're doing our research? When we do all of our research, there's an uncanny correlation between the plight of Black female athletes and the themes of identity, self-love, gender, and the pursuit of self-fulfillment. In Zora Hurston's classic, Their Eyes Were Watching God, this perspective provides a moment to reflect on the dominant narratives about sport and basketball and the Black athlete, creating a foundation in Black feminist pedagogy in the analysis of basketball and the Black athlete could lead to a more comprehensive understanding of issues related to the intersections of race and identity in sport. And so part of my case study is about examining sport and Blackness within Filipino and Mexicano communities. And so sports are a cultural institution that resonate with many Filipinos due to the impact of shared history, colonization, and cultural diffusion. Mexico and the Philippines share this, through colonization, Spanish-American War, and transnational labor relations. So I use previous research techniques with Mexican migrant families in the US to investigate the relationship and differences in Filipino basketball culture through the lens of race and ethnicity. So the sport but basketball has become a cultural institution that capitalizes on the global marketing of the NBA and transnational communities abroad. Current NBA players like Jordan Clarkson, who plays for the Filipino national team, Juan Toscano Anderson, who plays for the Mexican national team. You could even throw Rui Hachimura in there, who plays for the Japanese national team, offer an opportunity to explore the intersections of Blackness, nationalism, and ethnicity within and between the Philippines and Mexico. Mexican migrants use the cultural adaptation of sport to combat a colonial history that may be renegotiated while adapting to life in the U.S. During the 20th century, Filipino migrant communities in the U.S. endured discriminatory social microcosms through institutions like education. Still, sports have become integrated within Filipino migrant communities in the U.S. as a response to dominant social institutions that negate their transnational identity: basketball, boxing, plenty of billiards. So how do they use the sport of basketball to meet the challenges and insecurities of daily life in the U.S.? But furthermore, how do generations of Filipinos adapt to the challenges of cultural, ethnic, multi-ethnic adaptations over time? Are their individual and communal strategies similar or different from Mexican migrant communities, especially regarding a multi-ethnic Black experience? And my colleague Anthony Jerry just came out with a book on Black Mexico, and he talks about this multi-ethnic Black experience in Mexico and how that traverses both physical and political and cultural borders. And so this project parallels my previous ethnographic research to better understand how Filipinos in the U.S. over time and through generations use cultural adaptations of sport to frame and contextualize multi-ethnic experiences of Blackness. It represents and provides a voice to the Latino and Filipino community who have established cultural roots and households in the U.S. The sport of basketball is a cultural function where generations of Latinos and Filipinos in the U.S. find identity through sport. And so I'm hoping that my work within sports, within anthropology, sports anthropology, if we want to call it that, and commitment to conducting comparative analysis of culture within the sport is my primary motivator for this research. And so what I'm really trying to do with this project is, disrupt the discourse of sports studies by using an intersectional approach to race, ethnicity, and gender through sport. So I'm using my time as a scholar in residence at Wabash College to work with the Malcolm X Institute there and utilize the resources to theorize how race and colorization operate in the sporting context within and between Filipino and Mexicano communities in the U.S. No denying that, it's not a shock. The historical significance of the Black body as a commodity highlights how race has been constructed and commodified in the U.S. And so this history must be acknowledged and understood to fully grasp the impact of race on individuals and communities today. Furthermore, the sport of basketball and the Black athlete provides a lens through which we can examine these issues in a concrete and tangible way. Blackness, its erasure and turmoil through colonization operate more similarly in cultural and ethnic practices in these two distinct nation-state histories. The operationalization of Blackness or of basketball culture within and between these two ethnic groups is original, and I'm pushing the conversation of sporting identity to consider a more intersectional framework. I'm hoping after completing this data analysis that I'll be submitting the results in the spring for publication. So overall, it's crucial to approach issues of race and identity with caution, with reflection, with empathy, and with a deep understanding of how social identities intersect and impact individuals and communities. The concept of multi-ethnic identity is complex and multifaceted and requires a nuanced and intersectional analysis, incorporating methods in ethnic studies, intersectionality, Black feminist pedagogy, feminisms from the Southern Hemisphere. All of these are important into the analysis of how we could provide new insights and trajectories to research related to race and identity in sports studies. By recognizing the intersections of social identities and centering the voices and experience of marginalized individuals, we could work towards a more effective and equitable practices and procedures within scholarship on sport and anthropology. And so I'll just close with, this is my second conference here at Nash, and last year I was very fascinated. I was welcoming, and it's been just a wonderful experience, especially my colleague Dan Nathan, who's here, who's been very supportive and a longtime member. But one of my first questions with Nash, as being the North American, Society for Sport History, was I was sort of shocked that Nash has never been hosted in Latin America or Puerto Rico in the 50 years that it's happening. I know some colleagues are actively pushing that conversation, right? And so I think that's part of this conversation as well, right? And if there ever is if we ever do host Nash in Latin America or Puerto Rico, right, and I'm asked to be a liaison, I'll probably graciously decline. I could point people in the right direction, but that's not my work, right? What I'm talking about here is how do we actively engage in these conversations by being an active member, not just as a researcher, but as a person, right? But I hope one day we will have a Bienvenidos in Mexico and at a Nash. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo. Up next, we have Tracy Canada, but I do want to say that even though I am co-organizing this with Tracy and the symposium for Winter Grand, the work so far has not been equal. Tracy has done most of the heavy lifting, and so I am very grateful for her leadership and organizational work. And beyond that, also, even though Tracy is both younger than me in age and in years out of scholar and in the academy, I have been fortunate enough to be reading her work, and I'm happy to also say that I think that she is our leader, right, in many ways. And so I know I am very grateful for her leadership, intellectual leadership, and just looking forward to following you some more. Tracy Canada.
Younger and shorter. Thank you for that. I didn't know you were going to say that, so I really appreciate that. Thanks y'all for coming. Hopefully this is something that keeps going. We're really excited about the symposium that happens in Spain in March. So any ideas that y'all have about the things that we're throwing out earlier now and this afternoon, we're welcome to hear it. Okay, so I'll get started. Hopefully I can get this clicker to work. Less than a week ago, Michael Van Buren, a 4- or 5-star quarterback from the class of 2024, announced that he would play in college once he graduated, where he would play in college once he graduated from his Maryland high school. Let's see. Can I get it to work? Aha, there we go. Amidst offers from schools like Alabama, Michigan, Maryland, and Miami, University of Oregon beat out the others. When speaking to ESPN, Van Buren outlined why he chose Oregon. What stood out to me most would probably be just how bought in everyone is and how together everyone is. The team is very close. Everybody treats everybody like family, and the people in the building, they all have great energy, and everybody really wants people to succeed, and they're going to do everything they can to make sure that happens. And I've highlighted the part that I think is very interesting about this. I'm not surprised by Van Buren's comments, but I am skeptical. He saw what Oregon's football program wanted him to see. It's something that most college programs are trying to do. Coaches, administrators, academic advisors, equipment managers, athletic trainers, all folks that I argue are part of the football apparatus, are invested in building a tight, cohesive collective of individuals through the team. During my fieldwork experiences, spaces like the weight room, the practice field, and the playing field were filled with moments where the various people involved in the football spectacle worked as an organized unit to promote the success of the team in whatever way that meant at the time. College football programs order, surveil, and discipline their players, all in hopes of crafting an efficient team on the field. At Mellon University, a pseudonym for where I spent time during fieldwork, the team came to life through a hashtag that was constantly repeated as a way to reinforce the idea that the team was a unified force. Hashtag Mellon Crew was on the back of team-distributed shirts that players must wear, printed on plastic wristbands and in brochures, and uploaded with coaches' social media posts that forever live on the internet. The hashtag is an attempt to convey that despite football-related differences like playing positions and scholarship status or race and class background differences, these no longer matter once one becomes a Mellon teammate. It's an almost compulsory sense of group identity. Once a teammate, the player is no longer an individual, but is instead a member of the Mellon football team, someone who then represents and is in some way related to coaches, the staff, the athletic program, and the university. We're going back. There we go. It's easy to see just how prominently programs use this tactic. A quick check of social media finds plenty of examples. These kinds of mottos have infiltrated the space where because football coaches and staff rely upon narratives like #MellonCrew to infuse the team with the language and morality of family. The team must become a football family, one that will fight for each other on the field. And that fighting part on the field is important. Football players' athletic labor is exploited, happens to be violent, and is directly tied to a particularly crafted sporting body. Because of this, football players continuously engage in sporting labor that manifests in what Barbara Bordenhorn calls the work of being related. Upon membership on the team, all players are provided with the necessary pieces to create a family with their teammates, based on the attempt by administrators to flatten differences and evoke the tonality of care, trust, and solidarity within the group. The team is a ready-made, built-in, assumed family relation in sport that is always working towards the communal goal of as many wins as possible every season. So much energy is put into convincing teammates that they belong to the team family. On some level, this attempt is successful. The team is the most recognized and normative notion of community and family in sport in general and in football in specific, as we can see here. Ideally, the team becomes a football family through their athletic labor, and players are meant to come together for the greater good of their family. This is what Van Buren was responding to. However, this rhetoric is insincere. Erin Hatton disrupts this idea when she writes, "For these athletes, then, their sense of dehumanization, particularly commodification, was exacerbated by the pervasive rhetoric of care and family. Though their coaches often use this rhetoric, most of these athletes didn't ultimately feel cared for." Insights from my fieldwork help to explain why. In this world of play, individual football players come to matter and are cared for the good of the team. There's concern for players performing in laboring bodies, and its desired outcome is the ability to extract a player's productive value on the field. Football programs are only invested in winning games and generating revenue and securing prestige. The desire to win is never far from any administrative action, and this is clear in the motivation to create a football family. Programs merely see and use athletic bodies as commodities and invest in these bodies only to keep them healthy and interested enough to play. It's a form of objectification and dehumanization that Bell Hooks argues calls to mind, quote, "the history of slavery and plantation economy," end quote, a comparison that holds when considering the demographics of those on the team and those in administration, which we'll see in a second. Further, this rhetoric about football families is insincere because these popularized narratives about teams and teammates and football families often promote a post-racial narrative, effectively glossing over the importance of the racialized positionalities of the players themselves. This is where my work intervenes. For several reasons, Van Buren's opinion of the football family will likely change over time. I've learned that despite the ordered notion of the team encouraged by the administration and staff, Black players find their own ways to create, navigate, and maintain meaningful kinship relationships amongst themselves. This is a theory that I more thoroughly analyzed in my book about football, and I call it football brotherhood. But here's just one example of how this practically plays out amongst players. The violence enacted in the game is real only to the players because of the demands placed on their bodies. But these consequences are not evenly distributed amongst players, as Black athletes are statistically overrepresented on the football field and within certain playing positions on the field through a practice known as racial stacking. In short, the violence against bodies in football is more often than not enacted upon Black bodies. Further, violent encounters also become a concern off the field for Black players in ways that don't equally trouble their white counterparts. In addition to time on the field, it's this real-world experience that bonds Black players as brothers as they partake in care that is imagined as an antidote to violence, as noted by Sadia Hartman. And so now we go to field work because I am an anthropologist, right? One evening in early April 2018, I learned that Alexander was in the hospital. In addition to his knee surgery before the bowl game in December, he'd had wrist surgery in early March to correct an ongoing issue. Unfortunately, something went wrong and he was admitted for an emergency procedure to deal with an infection. Talking to him on the phone, he sounded pretty heavily medicated, so I promised to visit in the next couple days. However, later that night, I heard two players talking about going to see him. John was planning a visit that night with a few teammates. I was told I could tag along, but upon illegally parking my car near the large black SUV carrying Braxton, Trick, and John near the University Hospital, I had a feeling we were in the wrong place. I let them navigate us around the back of the hospital through construction, dirt trails, and unpaved parking lots. During the walk through the dimly lit paths, we filled the silence by talking about our own injuries and trips to the hospital. I talked about my recent hospital visits for a broken arm. Braxton described his most recent hamstring injury that required a painful stem cell procedure to correct. John had been dealing with back spasms and the troubling findings of a recent knee MRI. And surprisingly, Trick had never been seriously injured in college. We continued to walk around with John constantly checking his phone's navigation. And we eventually saw a person approaching us, the only one we'd seen all night. As we got closer, we saw that he was dressed in scrubs, an obvious marker that he belonged in the area much more than we did. John decided to ask for directions. Braxton giggled and sat on a nearby bench, separating himself from the upcoming conversation. Trick joined him, but I walked over with John. Shifting his eyes between the two of us and the two of them on the bench, the man explained that we were in the complete wrong place, which I knew, and that we needed to go to the main entrance on the main street that runs in front of the hospital. John and I thanked him, and we all kept walking. Almost immediately after, before the man was even out of earshot, Braxton and Trick started laughing. He looked so nervous. He just knew he was going to get robbed right after work, Braxton said, referring to the nervous energy and shift in body language we all noticed from the hospital worker. Braxton was assuming that the short white man was unsure of what would come from his interaction with 4 unknown young Black people at night behind the hospital. Assuming how their threatening appearance would be taken, Braxton and Trick separated themselves from the conversation. The guys laughed about the incident all the way back to the cars. Given our new strategy, we easily walked into the hospital from the main entrance. We signed in at the desk at the lobby, retrieving our name tags and learning which room Alexander was in. I decided to head up this mission, weaving us past gurneys and hallways before arriving at the correct hospital wing. Then we were confronted by the women at the main nursing station. "You have to let us see him," Trick started once we learned that Alexander already had too many visitors. "We know it's late. We won't stay for long." Braxton added, "Yeah, we promise. Please, you have to let us see our teammate," John jokingly pleaded as he pointed to his melon football shirt. "You know he's in there hurting without us." Entertained by their performance, I stayed quiet because I knew I would be part of the package deal if they could get through. The nurse, unable to hide her smile, shooed us through. I shouldn't be surprised that worked. I laughed as we walked down the hall. "You know how we do," John replied, looking down at me with a wink. And I knew exactly what he meant. I'd often seen players use their team affiliation to charm their way into or out of situations. Despite their paradoxical personal engagements with the team, they'd learned when it could come in handy. We proceeded down the long hall, counting off the room numbers until we got closer to the right one. But we were met by an unexpected sight once we got to the end. We could tell that Alexander's room was straight ahead, the last visible room before the hallway turned to the right. But 3 police officers stood against the blank wall between the corner at the left and Alexander's door on the right. Because of how the hall turned, it was difficult to tell if they were guarding Alexander's room or the one numerically before it. We slowed down and stopped talking. "What'd he do now?" John exclaimed. "Must be something serious since they said 3 of them," Braxton responded. These comments were directed at the seemingly excessive police presence in the hallway that John and Braxton assigned to Alexander's room. I figured they were joking, but I could feel the energy around me shift as we all cautiously approached. It's the hesitance that comes with interactions with the police, based on the racialized violence that sometimes follows. It wasn't until we were right at the rooms that we saw the police officers were there for the other room. There was a 4th one in there talking to that patient. "Had me worried there for a second," Braxton said under his breath as he knocked on Alexander's door. We entered the room after an anonymous voice said we could. The door closed behind us, and we each greeted Alexander as he sat in his hospital bed, surrounded by his mom and his younger sister. It was only then that John asked about the police officers. Apparently, Alexander's neighbor had been disrespecting the nurses, and reinforcements were called in to calm him down. "Well, that's strange," I said. "But not as strange as our time getting here," Trick said behind me. John filled the room in on our adventure around the back of the hospital. We all laughed, recognizing again how unexpected our journey there had been. I recount these events to bring attention to the oddly concurring interests that presented themselves that spring evening. Alexander's emergency surgery, the interaction with the hospital worker, and the police officers guarding the patient's room all spoke to different ways that Blackness and athleticism and violence and injury intersect and become important, sometimes even life or death, experiences in the everyday lives of Black college football players. In contrast to the daily traumas experienced by the Black players I worked with, David Leonard argues that white players often have a distinct, more privileged experience because of the systemic advantages offered by their whiteness, both on and off the field. However, the social experience of Blackness creates a particular intersection with the social world for Black players. They're aware of how they're stereotyped, racialized, and gendered beings in certain spaces at certain times. And knowing that this has the potential to lead to violence and injury in its various iterations, they often react accordingly to avoid any negative consequences. Interestingly, it's the awareness of these intersecting notions that allow for jokes to be made about them. These players are making fun of the need for a socially determined performance of identity. This awareness and their ability to joke about it allows them to form a specific Black brotherhood of shared sentiments and experiences. It's one of the many ways they care for each other. The Mellon players are playing around and making fun of each other in the midst of uncomfortable situations as a way to demonstrate their understanding of a collective struggle. What's going on here is closely aligned with what Jason De Leon notices as he describes ways that men crossing the US-Mexico border use humor to cope with structural violence, as they show awareness for their precarious situations and they resist the power of the US federal government. Mentioned here, the jokes about the hospital worker and the initial comments made about the police officers in the hallway all point to a keen awareness of racist and discriminatory behaviors that Black players often confront. They're using humor as a sophisticated way to signal their recognition of how problematic these situations are and how bad they could be. Perhaps the best representation of how and why humor is used comes from Hanif Abdurraqib. Reflecting on a game of spades with his friends, he writes, "I meet my enemies with silence and my friends with a symphony of insults, or jokes that cut just deep enough for people to see them for a short burst, but not so deep to leave a scar. Dearest siblings, even in an ass whooping, there's no place I'd rather be." Invoking a horizontal kin relation for these men, he notes the importance of shit talk as a marker of identity, or a marker of community and care. Thus, through playful banter that is meant to signal intimacy, not hurt, a brotherly care is on display. Black players negotiate the potential for injury and violence, given its likelihood on the football field and its real possibility in the anti-Black world outside of sport, by finding community and solace in each other as brothers and joking about it. The humor they're constantly engaged in represents how these Black players are preparing for and bracing themselves for what could happen as they navigate a world filled with the real potential for violence to be enacted against them. No matter Black players' supposed affiliation with an ordered team and football family, they're uniquely confronted with interactions that pose the risk of quotidian violence. These football brothers are successfully navigating these risks together, using this kin relation as a simultaneous marker of resistance and community. In the shadow of the activities and actions of those manipulating the team, which is the administrators and the coaches, Black players have agency in the transition from teammate to brother and are compelled by a form of care that's predicated on concern for a young man who takes the field and lives a life beyond it. That's why I'll be interested to learn if and when Michael Van Buren's perception of his new football team changes over time. Once he's a Duck, he might wear the paraphernalia and post the hashtags online and repeat the narratives to the media, but I imagine he'll soon prioritize the football brotherhood over the Oregon football family. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Also, at the last week, we were fortunate enough to have Stanley Bangarash volunteer to be our discussant. So we have a discussant, and we have about 20 minutes to incorporate his comments and then take questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here, and I'm really grateful to Tracy and Gabby for organizing this. Thank you for really making this space available for all of us. So I'm just going to give a really brief description of the really important work that these papers do, and then offer each of the panelists a question each, and then we'll open it up to the general audience. So what I thought as a major intervention of all of these papers is these conversations today asks us to think about race that is not bound within and is not negotiated only within national categories and institutional categories of race and Blackness. They ask us to think otherwise about a different methodology and theorization of race and Blackness that is not bound within institutional frameworks. And what these papers show us is the way that the movement of the bodies, both within sport borders and national borders includes mobile and shifting logics of race. Through these papers, we see a type of refusal to bind Blackness as knowable and one that is always negotiated in relation to many ethnic, class, religious, gendered, and sexualized others. These brilliant papers show us how sport needs to be a site that acknowledges the talking back and the possibility of other worlds, that imagine and reimagine Blackness is always on shifting terrain as multiple and in conversations for a different type of world building. So my questions that I want to ask the panelists, for the first panelist, Veena, is to think about like, what are the forms of global circuits of race and the histories of coloniality that deeply inflict how we think about Blackness in the region of Kerala? And with this, what are the ways that racialization of African players in Kerala differs from the ways in which Black players are racialized in the metropole in Western nations? And how does this racialization and conceptualization then allow us to think about how then through this racialization of African players that Malayalis create their own racializations of self? And with Bernardo's excellent paper, how can we address how, as you asked us to think about, like, how do we decenter whiteness? How can we also make sure that when we're engaging with mixed race and multi-ethnic identities, how can we make sure we do not unmark whiteness, right? There's a difference between centering and unmarking. How can we make sure we do not unmark whiteness in mixed race studies where white Asian and white Latino mixed race bodies have greater mobility and race and claims to racial and ethnic belonging within the category of Filipino and Mexican? And what happens to multi-ethnic players then who are not in Western sites, but playing in like the Mexican basketball leagues and then also in the Filipino basketball league, which is the second oldest in the world? And then for Tracy, I've been really honored to read parts of this much earlier. So I don't know how much new questions I can ask, but the question that came to mind for me, Tracy, is like, what are the ways that this performance of brotherhood as a necessary tool to navigate Blackness also becomes a site of ethno-nationalist politics that asks us to think about heteropatriarchy as a really important structuring device for thinking about Blackness and Black brotherhood, right? And in this ways, what are the ways that these spaces outside of institutional sport allow for a critique, allow for a narrative, and allow for a pleasure not readily available elsewhere, but still bound within forms of heteropatriarchy that silence certain voices, be it women or LGBTQI players, especially with football as a site where coming out as gay has become really tough. But thank you everyone for all of these papers, and I'm so honored to be here. So why don't we let them answer the questions first, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Yeah, Veena, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you, Stan, for the comments. They're very insightful, and I do not have, the whole response for these very brilliant things you have asked me to think through. But the one obvious thing which kept coming up while discussing race and racial difference in the context of South Asia was that it was not necessarily centered around whiteness, in the sense that most often it would be a brown-black relation within the context of brown-black relations. And most often what South Asians identify as fair or white would be considered as brown in some other parts of the West. So there is this slippery surfaces throughout even though the identifications of Black was very solid, right? And most often native players became very conscious about what skin color they were in. Most often there'd be misidentifications that certain native players would be identified as Black. And there would be these jokes that, you can just identify yourself as Black so that you'd be paid more. So that is one major thing that realized that how the Blackness is also in constant flux, and how whiteness is not necessarily at the center of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go. Thank you, Stan, for your comments. And I think as I'm working through these ideas and how I'm trying to decenter whiteness in terms of Blackness as a disposition between kind of this mentality and reality that we have to deal with in social, political, transnational settings. I think it is important, right, to make sure that we don't ignore the whiteness that exists within our own communities and populations. And so I'm trying to think about the spectrum of colorization in this kind of idea that I talk about in terms of ethnic virtue, right? In which, how is it that we navigate these spaces, as you say, right? Whether it's transnational, within communities, within households, within church, within basketball leagues, and how do we navigate these spaces depending on, when it's happening, where we're at, who's playing, who we're interacting with, because that is a real component in terms of how individuals within households, within communities, and how they navigate spaces, particularly on the basketball court. And so I think about this in my own work in Mexican households, right? About how colorization is oftentimes this is never talked about, but subconsciously occurs in these very, very real ways. So thank you for that comment, because I think it's important to make sure that we don't, that I don't ignore that, to try to make sure that I recognize it as a reality in which these individuals are experiencing.
Let's see. Yeah, it is on. Thanks, Dan, for those comments that you were able to come up with on the fly. Hopefully one day I will be able to do that in my career. But as of right now, I can't. I have so many comments from you that I'm still trying to process all of the stuff that you've given me, which is fantastic, and I really appreciate it. But even and what you have sent on other things that I've written, but also in this, the thing that keeps coming up for me that I think is really insightful that you've picked out in the things that I've given you, so I appreciate this, is the idea that when you play a sport in college, but specifically a sport like football, it is no longer play, right? Like, it's not playful, it's not fun, it's very, it's modern in the way that I talk about it. Like, it's a modern sport in the way that it's capitalistic, and it's about the commodification of the body, and it's just not play anymore, right? And there's a distinct difference between play and sport. And so part of what I noticed Black players doing was being playful in their lives, but also in their experiences of sport, right? Like, they were putting play back into something that was no longer fun for them. Fun in the way that it had been when they were like a kid, right? Like, I don't think that they would say that they weren't having fun still, but it was just a different type of play that they were incorporating. But even with that, as you mentioned, they're working within a particular structure that is patriarchal. It is paternalistic in a certain way too. There are certain ideas of hegemonic masculinity that that run all through it. And I think that the ways that comes out and became very clear for me, if we're talking about one, sexuality, and two, gender, I was a woman in that space, right? So like, it was always very clear that I was a woman. And they always made it clear that I was a woman. That's actually the paper that I'm going to write for the Wintergreen Symposium, is how football consistently made me into a woman. By the ways that players interacted with me, by the ways that coaches interacted with me, by the jokes that they would or would not tell, depending on who was around. Once they got more comfortable with me, I recognized that they would say different things before they were not saying those things, right? Like, I learned very intimate details about their lives once I knew them more. But a lot of that was because of the way that gender played out in those spaces. But then the other way that I can tell that sexuality mattered, right, is because no one ever talked about it. So it's not even that it's structuring it to, like, it's not that there were, like, the way that the structure was working was to essentially erase the fact that that was even a thing.
Yep.
And also the fact that nobody that I know that I worked with was gay. They were never open about it. They could have been, they probably were. Like statistically, it's almost impossible for none of them to have been, but none of them said that, right? And so there are all of these ways that they were playing around with each other, creating a particular form of care amongst themselves to care for each other in the face of this like not care that they were receiving from their football programs and from their universities, but it's still quite limited in what you're saying, right? And I think that there are certain things that I was able to see, I say this all the time in my work, right? And actually Vina's work veers very nicely with what I'm doing too, just because she was a woman working with men in her sport, is the way that being a woman in those spaces made you attuned or not to a lot of the stuff that came out in what you're talking about. And so those are things that I'm always thinking about, but I really appreciate the way that you flagged that because now I can think about it more. Yeah, thanks. If anybody has any questions, like we're open to questions. I think we have 8 minutes because we want to be able to take a break before lunch. But if anybody has any questions, I think we do have to talk into the mic so that Vina can hear if anybody would like to chat with us or communicate.
Yeah, there's a mic there, Susan. Thank you.
I'd like to address this question to Tracy and Bernardo, sort of following up on the session we had yesterday where we tried to talk about the relationship between sport anthropology and sport history. And I would like to ask you guys about the relationship between your scholarship and some of these, area specific subfields that you would be engaging with, which is probably American studies, African American studies, and Latin American studies, and maybe there's another one in there. So I'd like to know your impression of the status of sports studies within these areas, whether it's peripheral, whether it's mainstream. Is your research filling in huge gaps? Are you respected? Are you welcomed? Are you not? Could you just give us a little bit of a sense of the status of sports studies in these particular areas?
Sure. I can kind of speak to where I'm positioned currently, like at my current institution and at my previous institution. But more currently because of the work that I'm citing. Most of what I read and what I cite is in Black studies, and in anthropology, right? But it's Black studies heavy, especially because a lot of the arguments that I'm making are about the plantation logics of college football. And the folks that are writing about plantation logics, which have nothing to do with sport, but just about the way that has infiltrated US everyday life, right? They're in Black studies. Some of them are in English, but they're predominantly in Black studies departments, and that's where that's what their degrees are in. I would say that I don't think that I flag myself as a sports studies person. Like, I don't think anyone could read my work or listen to me talk and not think that I'm in sports studies or not think that I work on sport. But often when I describe the work that I do, it is using sport to talk about race, to talk about anti-Blackness, to talk about gender, to talk about kinship, to talk about care. And so I don't know even if I'm well accepted in sports studies spaces, right? Like, I'm not even sure. Because being an anthropologist also does make me read different in those spaces, right? Like when you go to, and this could be like a whole conversation about conferences, right? Like if you go to NAS, and I present at NAS, like I still read funny at NAS because like they're not reading ethnography, right? And like all of my stuff is ethnographic, or I'll take something from the news as I did today, like from the news that week or something that happened like a couple weeks ago and I want to incorporate it. And that still reads funny to sociologists sometimes. And if I go to AAA where the anthropologists are, like they really don't know what I'm doing because of the sports stuff, right? But then if I come here, like I'm not a historian. So like, I don't know if I really fit in anywhere, but Black studies has never been like, well, you don't belong here, right? Like because of the arguments and the theoretical contributions that I'm trying to make, I've never felt shunned by these, I don't know if we want to call them area studies, but like the different, like the where my theory comes from, like that has never been a problem that I work on sport, primarily because I work on an American sport that is heavily dominated by Black men, right? And it's not something that people can shy away from. The way that I like to frame my work is that like, whether you love it or hate it, you have an opinion about American football. And so that is something that people can relate to in whatever way. And so using that as an entry point to then talk about the ways that Black people have historically been exploited, how Black people are trying to thrive and survive in these extractive systems, the ways that Black bodies have been used and abused and like just used up, right? Those are all arguments that Black studies are like, yeah, we're with you, and that makes total sense. And so to use sport to do that, I think they find novel, and they're into it from my experience.
Yeah, I would say personally at the core, I come from a rich tradition of family of Chicano scholars and activists from California. And so I would say at the core, really, that's my root in terms of epistemological, ideological concept, and that's where I start everything from. And so it's kind of like I was describing in terms of engaging with my own scholarship is engaging with my own experiences first, and how those really frame my understanding of what I'm viewing, what I'm experiencing, who I'm talking to, and how I'm experiencing those things. And so I don't know if I find a lot of comfort knowing that in Latino studies, especially in Chicano studies, or at Knox conference, which is an annual conference for Chicano studies, that perspective, that viewpoint, that trajectory is very much welcomed. And there's a lot of overlap with Chicano scholars and Latin American, Latino, Latinx scholarship at the AAA in anthropology. But really that's the core in which I start everything with. So for example, even in my own work, right, I'm very privileged to have my mom here today and to be able to travel from wherever. And my toes will literally be in the sand in Mexico tomorrow. Right. But I have those privileges because I'm documented. I have come from a certain class background, and I have those privileges. Right. So what does that mean when I'm writing about Mexican migrant communities, right, who interact and struggle on a daily basis with a number of different things? Part of the reason why I bring my mom here is because I've talked to my own community, right? And they ask me about going and traveling places, and like, their experiences of missing their sons who they haven't seen in 10 years and things like that. So for me, this is where all my work starts. And so I think a lot of times maybe it goes over the head, and not just anthropology, but many disciplinary or higher academic studies, but it's very much welcomed with some scholars who have been a part of NASH for a very long time. Jorge Iber, who is my editor for my book, who's been a long time member. Saw Sam Regalado, who's here today. He was, or yesterday, and he's always here. And Jose Alamillo has been very supportive in Chicano studies from California. So I would say a lot of where I feel where I feel most comfortable and where I feel most supported is within those circles. But I'm eager and excited to branch out and see where the synergies lie with African American studies and other ethnic studies, but also with history and journalism and all the other disciplines. And I'll also say, I also feel very fortunate in being at a small college like Skidmore College. We're very unique in which we have a lot of scholars who focus on sports, who have done research on sports. As I said, my colleague Dan Nathan, who's in American Studies. We have a colleague, Murat, who's in history. We have Jeff Seagrave. So it's a very unique place, and I just feel very fortunate to happen to just stumble in there. But I feel like in terms of my day-to-day interactions and teaching and scholarship, I feel very fortunate to have stumbled upon a group of individuals who take interdisciplinarity seriously and who actively engage in conversations with one another.
Maybe one more question if anybody has one, but if not. Oh, that was good. Look at us, ending right on time too.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. I don't know who's been. Put it right up. Oh,
I think I left it up.
I need to.